There is a dangerous myth that floats around in conversations about healing. It sounds spiritual. It sounds mature. It sounds evolved. Forgive them, and you will be free. And in many situations, forgiveness can indeed be liberating. But when you are dealing with a narcissistic personality, forgiveness is not always freedom. Sometimes it is an invitation. When you have been entangled with a narcissist, you were not in a normal relationship conflict. You were in a psychological power dynamic. You were trained to doubt your own perception. You were conditioned to accept crumbs and call them meals. You were made to feel that your boundaries were attacks and your needs were selfish. So when you decide to forgive without accountability, you are not simply letting go of resentment. You may be quietly reopening access to the very system that harmed you. A narcissist does not interpret forgiveness the way emotionally healthy people do. They do not sit in reflection and think about growth. They do not experience remorse in a way that leads to transformation. Instead, forgiveness often registers as validation. It tells them the behavior was survivable. It tells them the consequences were temporary. It tells them you are still available. This is where it backfires. Because while you are telling yourself that you are choosing peace, they are calculating opportunity. While you are trying to rise above bitterness, they are noticing that the door is not fully closed, and for someone who thrives on control, access is everything. You have to understand the psychological structure here. Narcissistic patterns are rooted in entitlement and a deep inability to tolerate shame. Accountability feels like annihilation to them. So when you forgive too quickly, especially without changed behavior, you relieve them of the one pressure that might have required growth. You absorb the discomfort so they do not have to encounter. And that is not healing. That is self-abandonment disguised as compassion. Many survivors of narcissistic dynamics are empathic, reflective, and deeply self-aware. You are used to looking inward. You ask yourself what you could have done differently. You replay conversations. You search for the lesson. But a narcissist is not doing the same internal audit. They are scanning for leverage. Forgiveness, in this context, can become leverage. When you say, "I forgive you," without boundaries, without distance, without consequences, what they may hear is, "I will tolerate this again." And because narcissistic behavior runs on patterns, not promises, the cycle resumes. The charm returns. The apologies sound poetic. The future faking begins again. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you find yourself shrinking. This is why forgiving a narcissist often backfires, not because forgiveness itself is wrong, but because forgiveness without boundaries feeds the very dynamic you are trying to escape. It rewards manipulation with access. It answers exploitation with availability. Real healing does not require you to reconcile with someone who has not changed. It does not demand that you grant emotional clearance to someone who never took responsibility. Sometimes healing means understanding that closure is something you give yourself, not something you nocate with a person who thrives on your confusion. You can release anger without reopening contact. You can let go internally without inviting them back externally. That is the distinction that protects you. Forgiveness is powerful when it is rooted in strength, but when it is rooted in hope that they will finally become the person you needed them to be, it becomes a trap. And the cost of that trap is often your peace, your clarity, and your sense of self. So before you rush to forgive in the name of growth, ask yourself a harder question. Has anything truly changed? Or am I about to teach them once again that my boundaries are negotiable, The illusion of mercy feels noble in the beginning. It makes you feel evolved, compassionate, emotionally intelligent. You tell yourself that holding on to anger is heavy, that resentment keeps you stuck, that being the bigger person is a sign of strength. And in many relationships, that is true. But when you have lived through manipulation, gaslighting, silent treatments, and cycles of idealization and devaluation, mercy can quietly become a vulnerability. In your life, forgiving a narcissist too soon often was not about peace. It was about hope. Hope that this time they understood. Hope that this time they saw your pain. Hope that this time the apology meant transformation. But narcissistic patterns are not powered by misunderstanding. They are powered by entitlement and the need for control. So when you extend mercy without evidence of deep change, you are not closing a chapter. You are reopening access. Think about what happened the last time you forgave without boundaries. The tension softened. The conflict seemed to dissolve. There may have been affection, promises, even tears. You felt relief. You wanted to believe that your compassion had healed something. But slowly, almost predictably, the old behaviors resurfaced. The criticism disguised as concern. The subtle digs at your confidence. The rewriting of history. The rewriting of history. The blame that circled back to you. Mercy did not transform them. It reassured them. A narcissist does not interpret forgiveness as a sacred second chance. They often interpret it as proof that the consequences are temporary. If you stay, if you accept the apology, if you minimize what happened, they learn that the cycle works. They learn that with enough charm or pressure, the slate can be wiped clean, without real accountability. And each time that pattern repeats, your tolerance expands while your boundaries shrink. The illusion is believing that your empathy can heal someone who is not invested in self-reflection. You may have thought that by modeling compassion, you would inspire growth, but growth requires discomfort. It requires sitting with shame and choosing to change. When you rush to remove that discomfort by forgiving too quickly, you absorb the emotional cost they were meant to face. In your own experience, notice how often mercy was followed by confusion. You forgave, yet you still felt uneasy. You sensed something was unfinished. That is because forgiveness without safety does not create peace. It creates cognitive dissonance. Your heart says, be kind. Your nervous system says, be careful. And when you override that internal alarm in the name of mercy, you teach yourself that your intuition is negotiable. Sometimes it looks like replying to a message, agreeing to one more conversation, accepting a vague apology, allowing access to your emotional world again. And manipulation does not always return with obvious cruelty. It often returns with subtle influence, with guilt, with reminders of shared history, with carefully placed vulnerability, designed to pull you back into the role you once played. The real strength in your life was never in how much you could forgive. It was in how clearly you could see pate, orange, and choose differently. Mercy, without boundaries, keeps you tied to a cycle. Mercy with boundaries protects your growth. When you understand that forgiveness does not require reconnection, you begin to step out of the illusion and into clarity, where compassion for yourself becomes more important than rescuing someone who never truly chose to change. Compassion has always been one of your greatest strengths. You are the person who tries to understand before judging, who listens deeply, who gives second chances because you believe people are more than their worst moments. That quality is beautiful in healthy relationships. It builds trust, safety, and connection. But in a dynamic with a narcissist, That same compassion can slowly be reshaped into something that works against you. In your life, kindness did not begin as weakness. It began as integrity. You chose empathy because it aligns with your values. When they lashed out, you looked for the wound behind the behavior. When they blamed you, you searched for what you could improve. When they withdrew affection, you wondered how you could restore closeness. You were operating from emotional maturity. They were operating from control. The problem is not that you are compassionate. The problem is that compassion without boundaries becomes access. And access, in the hands of someone who manipulates, becomes leverage. Notice how often your understanding was used to excuse patterns that hurt you. You told yourself they had a difficult childhood. You reminded yourself they were under stress. You rationalized their anger as insecurity. Each time you softened the narrative, you also softened the consequences. Your kindness became the cushion that absorbed the impact of their behavior. A narcissist studies what works. Consciously or unconsciously, they learn your emotional language. They recognize that you respond to vulnerability. They notice that when they show just enough remorse, you open the door again. When they hint at abandonment wounds, you lean in. When they accuse you of being cold or unforgiving, you rush to prove your warmth. Over time, your compassion is no longer just a trait. It becomes a tool they can activate. This is how kindness becomes their weapon. They may use guilt, reminding you of everything they have done for you. They may play the victim, framing your boundaries as cruelty. They may accuse you of lacking empathy when you finally speak up. And because you pride yourself on being fair and understanding, those accusations land heavily. You begin questioning yourself instead of questioning the pattern. In your experience, the turning point likely came when you realized that no amount of empathy was creating change. You explained your feelings calmly. You offered solutions. You forgave. You adjusted. Yet the cycle persisted. The criticism returned. The manipulation resurfaced. The emotional instability remained. That is when the truth starts to emerge. Compassion cannot fix someone who benefits from the imbalance. Healthy compassion includes limits. It says, I care about your pain, but I will not allow you to cause mine. It says, I can understand your struggles without tolerating your mistreatment. Boundaries are not the opposite of kindness. They are the structure that protects it. When you begin to set boundaries, a narcissist often escalates. Not because you are wrong, but because the dynamic is shifting. Your kindness is no longer freely available. Your empathy is no longer unconditional access. And that loss of control feels threatening to someone who relied on it. The most empowering shift in your life is realizing that you can remain compassionate without being compliant. You can care without collapsing. You can understand without absorbing. When your kindness is paired with self-respect, it stops being a weapon in someone else's hands and becomes a strength anchored in clarity, where you no longer confuse enduring harm with being loving and no longer sacrifice your emotional safety to prove that you have a good heart. There comes a moment in your life when you have to ask yourself a difficult question. Am I healing, or am I simply becoming more skilled at tolerating what hurts me? Because repeating a toxic cycle can feel deceptively familiar. It can even feel like love, the intensity, the apologies, the reconnection, the temporary calm. Your nervous system learns the rhythm, and familiarity starts to masquerade as destiny. Healing, on the other hand, feels unfamiliar. It feels quiet. It feels firm. It requires you to sit with discomfort instead of rushing back to what you know. And when you have been in a narcissistic dynamic, that choice becomes even more critical. Because repetition is not accidental. It is a pattern reinforced every time boundaries collapse under pressure. In your experience, the cycle likely had predictable stages. The idealization that made you feel chosen, the subtle criticisms that made you work harder, the devaluation that left you confused, the rupture that broke you, and then the apology or the charm that pulled you back in. Each return felt like relief, but it was relief from a pain that the same dynamic created. That is not healing, that is recycling. Healing requires clarity. It asks you to stop romanticizing potential and start evaluating patterns. It asks you to look at behavior over promises. When you begin to see the pattern clearly, you may feel grief, not just for the relationship, but for the version of yourself who kept hoping this time would be different. That grief is part of growth. It means you are waking up. Choosing self-respect is rarely dramatic. It does not always come with a grand speech or a final confrontation. Sometimes it is a quiet decision to stop explaining yourself, to stop defending your boundaries, to stop chasing closure from someone who benefits from keeping you confused. It is the moment you realize that love should not require you to shrink. Recycling toxic cycles often feels easier because it delays loneliness. It delays uncertainty. It allows you to stay in a known script, but every repetition erodes something inside you. Your confidence weakens. Your intuition dulls. Your standards lower, just enough to accommodate behavior you once swore you would never accept. Healing strengthens those very things. It sharpens your intuition. It rebuilds your self-trust. It teaches your nervous system that peace is not boring. It is safe, and safety is not something you negotiate. It is something you require. In your life, the shift likely began when you noticed that the cost of staying was higher than the fear of leaving. You realized that every time you went back, you were not just giving them another chance. You were giving up a piece of yourself. Self-respect means deciding that no connection is worth that trade. This is not about perfection. It is about awareness. You may feel the pull to return. You may question your decision. That does not mean you are weak. It means you are breaking a pattern that once defined your emotional world. Patterns resist change, but growth demands it. When you choose self-respect, you are not rejecting love. You are redefining it. You are saying that love must include accountability, consistency, and care. You are teaching yourself that intensity is not intimacy, and that chaos is not passion. And with each boundary you hold, each silence you maintain, each urge you resist, you move further away from repetition and closer to a life where your peace is not constantly under negotiation. The kind journey of stepping away from a narcissistic cycle is not a single act, but a series of conscious choices that honor your dignity. Every time you resist the pull to explain, justify, or re-engage, you are reclaiming the authority over your own life. You begin to recognize that peace is not found in their validation, but in the firmness of your boundaries. Your self-worth is not contingent on their recognition. It is inherent, non-negotiable, and unshakable. And healing becomes an act of courage. It means sitting with discomfort rather than seeking temporary relief in their familiarity. It means letting go of the fantasy of change that never arrives and trusting in the reality of your own strength. You start to understand that forgiveness, when it is given too early, can be an open door to manipulation. True closure is not granted by them. It is created by you through reflection, self-compassion, and unwavering respect for your own limits. In this process, you reclaim your emotional energy. You reclaim your clarity, your confidence, and your ability to trust your intuition. Life begins to feel lighter, not because the past is erased, but because you have chosen yourself over the cycle. Every day, every decision, every boundary becomes a declaration that your peace matters more than their patterns, and that your growth will never be optional.